Hello and welcome to our podcast on some suggestions for getting through the ACT English test. This is one of the 4 or perhaps 5 subtests of the ACT, depending on if you're taking just the reading, English, science, and math, or if you're also taking the writing portion of the ACT. So these suggestions are specifically just for the English part, but in general they tend to be decent suggestions for all of the subtests. So real quick, just in terms of format, the ACT English test will have 5 passages. There will be 15 questions on each one for a grand total of 75, and then you'll have 45 minutes to complete that exam. Now the time period for this is 45 minutes for the English portion. This is about 10 minutes difference than what you are asked to use on the reading portion, which is good and bad. But ultimately, we tend to see more kids being able to finish the English portion of the ACT test than we do the reading portion. Something about that reading test, there's a lot of reading and not a lot of time. But here on the English one, since you're not doing as much reading, it's more focused on the grammar, then you are able to answer more questions and finish with a reasonable amount of time. Just a note about the readings that you'd be asked to quote-unquote read. They are on a variety of subjects, from history to narratives, things like that, but they are going to be essay in nature, nonfiction in nature. They're not going to be short stories or poems or excerpts from novels. So this will be all nonfiction reading. In addition, there are 2 categories of types of questions that come up in this English exam. One is usage and mechanics, and the other is rhetorical skills. So what do we mean by usage and mechanics? By the way, before we get into this, pretty much all of these smaller parts of this test, all these little subtests we might call them, we have podcasts on all of these. So if in any of these things you feel like you're not doing a great job or need a little bit of review, you can certainly watch the podcast on these smaller subtests in order to do better on the English test as a whole. But usage and mechanics tends to be things like subject and verb agreement, verb formation, pronouns and antecedents, comparatives and superlatives, and idioms. And so what we mean by those are agreement tends to be things like making sure that your subjects agree with your verbs in being plural or singular. And they're not going to ask you simple things like the kids is in school. They're going to ask you more challenging things like indefinite pronouns. So the examples of each student in my class is sitting ready to go, or each of the classes are ready to go to the assembly. The pronoun of each could be rather confusing. And so you might have agreement questions like that. They're not going to be simple, basic things. They're going to be a little bit more complicated. Verb formation, how do we make the past participle of a verb? How do we make the future perfect? That type of thing. Pronouns and antecedents, again, kind of like the indefinite pronouns. How do we make sure we're using who and whom correctly? Is it he or is it him in this particular case? That kind of stuff. Comparatives and superlatives. How do we say that something is good, better, or best? Something like that. Best is the superlative, better is the comparative. What is the correct form of these words to make them compare things? And then idioms are kind of figures of speech. Usually they're short phrases, things that if you look at them individually by their words, they don't make the correct sense in terms of what we actually interpret. For example, something like, it's raining cats and dogs. Literally, if you took each part of that and looked at it, you'd think you'd look out your window and you would see cats and dogs flying from the sky. But in English, we agree that that phrase of raining cats and dogs actually means that it's raining pretty hard. This is also going to deal with transitions. When do you use however versus whereas versus therefore, that kind of stuff. So those are English specific things, and it's going to go ahead and test your knowledge of those as you go. Some other stuff in usage and mechanics would be punctuation and sentence structure. Punctuation is going to be your use of commas, semicolons, dashes, periods, run-on sentence avoidance, that kind of stuff. And then sentence structure is comprised of a couple things like parallelism. So when we have multiple things that are grammatically parallel, they should be in the same structure. relationships of clauses, and misplaced modifiers. So if we see a sentence that is something like, I hit the cat with the broom, do you really mean that you walked up to a cat and hit it and that cat was holding a broom? Or do you mean that you used a broom to hit the cat and get it out of your way? That modifier of with the broom and that whole Pandora's box of misplacing them is something that might be tested here. They want to make sure that you are being very clear in your choices and modifying the correct things. The other part of the ACT English test is what we call rhetorical skills, and these are questions that evaluate the essay's purpose. Was it just to inform us, entertain, persuade, things like that? It may ask us to add, revise, or delete material. And so there are questions like, if the author wanted to add a sentence at this point in the essay, which of these choices would be the best for that? Or, if the author wanted to be more concise and delete information, which sentence could be taken out without affecting meaning? Something like that. They may also ask you questions about organization and style. Style is usually making sure that it's all in the same tense, making sure it's all in the same level of formality. So you would not have an essay that is very academic in nature, sounding very stuffy and highfalutin, and then all of a sudden say something like, I think. That changes the level of formality. So that might be a question there where they're trying to get you to all be in the same level of formality and or in the same tense, stuff like that. So here's some suggestions on how to do better or even well on that test. Skim the passages. You're not reading for entertainment, you're not reading for understanding necessarily, you're just trying to get to the grammatical questions that they are asking. So focus on those underlined sections, but just kind of skim pretty quickly. Number 2 on there, definitely make sure that you find the underlined passages because that's where the questions come from, but then go ahead and make sure that you read a little bit before that underlined passage and after that, because oftentimes they want to see how that sentence fits in relation to other stuff. And so you need to make sure that you are finding the context first and then able to put the sentence in the correct format. Some other suggestions when you are skimming and scanning and you come across those underlined sections, if you feel like the underlined section is wrong, try to predict what should be there. Then go to your answer choices and select the idea that is the closest to that. If you're just blindly guessing by the time you get to the answers, that's kind of a problem. But I think a better, more efficient, more effective way is to look at it and say, hey, I know that this is a run-on. I should expect to see a comma and a conjunction in my choices. And if it's not, then maybe you have to go back and check it. But as soon as you see the answer that you predict, that's probably the right answer. Go with your gut. And then ultimately, if you have to, process of elimination in terms of the choices is a viable option. It's multiple choice. There are 5 choices for each one, I believe. So you can go ahead and look through there. Usually a couple of them are going to be kind of way out there, and 2 or maybe 3 of them are going to be reasonable. So if you have to narrow it down and maybe pick between 2 or 3, that's better than trying to pick between all 5. So a little bit more advice here in terms of the delete choice or the no change choice. You do need to take those seriously. They're not just thrown in there for the heck of it. Usually when there is a question that says, usually when you have a question who has an answer choice as delete this section, that tends to be right about 50% of the time. Now the ACT usually favors passages that are more concise and not wordy or verbose. So if you see words that are repeated, that are basically saying the same thing twice, or that seem to just be thrown in there for the heck of it, then delete might be a viable option. It might be a logical and correct choice. You can't always just pick delete, thinking that that's the way to go, but it is going to be right about 50% of the time. So use that as an option. Also, on a lot of these, if not all of them, you're going to see the choice of make no change, meaning leave it exactly the way it's written in there. Take that seriously. Again, probably about 50% of the time, give or take, no change is the correct answer. They want to see that, do you really know your stuff? Do you trust your instincts? Do you know the rules, or are you just trying to process of elimination, guessing at them? So if you do see no change, that might be the right answer. So again, if you're skimming and scanning and you're coming across an underlined section and you look at it and go, you know what, that sounds perfectly fine because that's a great use of the colon, then leave it. Perhaps no change is the right answer. Ultimately, on this one, if you are running out of time, just like on any other part of the ACT test, you should guess. Go ahead and fill in every bubble. Don't leave anything blank. If you can narrow it down, do so. So you're only choosing between 2 or maybe 3 options, fine. But if you're absolutely running out of time and you see that your 45 minutes is up and you have 10 more to go, there's no way you can accurately answer them, just make sure you bubble in something. And there's some debate about how you should guess. Should you just guess straight C's down the line to finish out your test, or straight A's, or whatever? For good or for bad, the ACT test has set it up so that all answer spots, A, B, C, D, or E, those are all about equally represented. So you may be better off just kind of randomly guessing A, B, C, D every single time and picking one from those rather than just going straight down. Either way, if you're running out of time, fill something in. Don't leave it blank. You might get something right that you didn't think you could. Even if you didn't know it, just fill it in. So I think that's about it. As always, there's probably way more test-taking tips that are out there. My personal philosophy, though, is that we need to be spending about 95 to 98% of our time talking about the real grammar here. That's way more important than preparing for one test with the 180 days we have of school. I feel like we need to know parallel structure. I feel like we need to make sure we understand agreement, how the colon works, how capital letters work, how subjects and verbs agree. Those are way more important for life and for papers and for the things we'll be writing. They are a little bit important in terms of this test, but I feel like we should be spending about 98% of our time talking about real grammar for real grammar's sake. This podcast represents our 2 to 5% of our time. We're just going to give you some tips, take them or leave them. Hopefully they'll help you out, give you guys some good guidance, and maybe help you score a couple more as we go through the test. The other reason we wanted to share this with you is you definitely don't want to take any time in the actual testing environment to read the directions. They're the same on every single test, every single version across the nation. So don't take any time reading those directions. Just get in there as soon as they say start. You are answering away. Use all of your time to maximize your ability to get those right. And hopefully this has guided you a little bit in that manner. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to bring those in the class and we will get those shored up for you. Thanks so much for listening and good luck on the test. Thanks.